Hey, and welcome to the Weed Out, where we weed out the bullshit and talk about the nonsense happening in our backyard. I'm Spencer Fox Peterson, and today we are being joined with a familiar voice. Andrew Quemere is calling in to discuss a story he's been covering uh, regarding a man named James Carver. James Carver was convicted of murdering 15 people after an eyewitness identified him in court. But decades later, a psychologist says the identification was scientifically unreliable. And so this story is about James Carver out of Beverly, Mass. And Andrew, before we get any deeper into it, hey, and welcome.
Yeah, good to be back. It's been a while since I did a show with you.
And tell us a little bit about what's going on with James Carver. You know, the status. You have an article on Mass Dump called "Eyewitnesses ID a Man Serving Life for Deadly Fire Was Unreliable," and
Well, yeah, there's the eyewitness part, but there's actually a lot more to it than that. So just to jump back, this fire happened in Beverly 40 years ago, as of July 4th this year. So this is a really horrific fire. It was at a rooming house, which you don't hear too much about rooming houses. They used to be kind of a thing where they were cheap places to live. You would have like a room to yourself, but then you'd like share a bathroom with all the people on the floor that you lived on or whatever, or a few bathrooms per floor. And they were like a way that people could live kind of on the cheap. And this particular rooming house is called the Elliott Chambers, and a lot of sort of the poorest people in Beverly were living there. There were like some of the people were psychiatric patients who, they're discharged from these mental institutions like Danvers State Hospital, which is now closed. And they'd be like looking for housing for these people, and they'd put them up in the send them off to the rooming house. It was a cheap place where people could live. Um, but this place burned down on the morning of July 4th. It was really horrific. It's a 3-story building, commercial space on the first floor, and then the rooming house is on the second and third floor. And you had 36 people living there. 15 of them died. So this was the deadliest fire in Massachusetts since the Coconut Grove fire in, I believe, like the 1950s or no 1940s. And this fire happened in 1984. So and it remains the deadliest fire since Coconut Grove. So like really horrific, really tragic fire. But then the investigators, they sort of immediately tell the public, we think this was arson. We think somebody set this fire. It wasn't for another about 4 years. They finally arrest this guy, James Carver, and he goes on trial the following year in 1989. And he's convicted, but before he's convicted, there's a mistrial because it turns out that the prosecutor was withholding exculpatory evidence. And you may have heard, like recently, the Alec Baldwin trial, the prosecutor was withholding exculpatory evidence. The judge threw out the case, and now Alec Baldwin is a free man. He doesn't have to worry about being charged again because of the misconduct by the prosecutor. That's not what happened here. The judge just said, well, you will do the trial over again. So he went on trial a second time, and he's convicted. And that was almost 35 years ago now. So he's been in prison. I think actually he's been in prison a bit longer than that because he was in prison pre-trial. So they revoked his bail. So he's been in prison maybe like 35, 36 years. But he is represented by 2 attorneys now who are not his original attorney. They are, one of them, her name is Lisa Kavanaugh. She's from the State Public Defender's Office. She runs the Innocence Program there. And his other lawyer is Charlotte Whitmore, who is an attorney at the Boston College Innocence Program. And they have put together this whole case, which recently went before a judge. They had a whole hearing about it with testimony and everything, basically arguing that there is scientific evidence that cast doubt on like the entire theory of this case. So the theory of the case is James Carver goes to the rooming house in the middle of the night because he's mad that a guy who lived there had dated his ex-fiance. He's so mad he wants to kill this guy. So there's a drugstore on the first floor. Some newspapers were delivered there. The theory is he moves the newspapers to the entrance of the rooming house. He pours some gasoline on them and sets them on fire. And a cab driver who drove by says, I saw James Carver there. And he also says there was like a car nearby that looked like James Carver's car. But there is just like a mountain of evidence casting doubt on this entire thing. Not just the eyewitness testimony, which you mentioned earlier, but that the fire was even arson in the first place, because this arson stuff, there's been a lot of scientific developments in kind of the study of fire since, like the 70s and 80s. And it used to basically be the guy who investigates arsons is some firefighter or some cop who learned how to investigate arsons from some other firefighter or some cop. They take some training courses, but they have like a high school diploma. There's no scientific background for any of these people. And they're just kind of passing down all these myths about fire. And a lot of these myths were used to show that this was supposedly an arson. Like the investigator in this case said the fire had to have started outside the entrance to the rooming house because it was the lowest place where there was evidence of burning. And fire will always burn up. But that's not true. Like fire can spread downward. And so Carver, he now has an expert who is like a well-respected fire safety engineer named Craig Byler, who's, written all kinds of scientific papers. And, he basically has said that this case is like junk. Like he said that in his opinion, this guy, Craig Byler, so this entrance where this fire is believed to have started, it's like an alcove with a doorway. And the theory originally was the fire started on the newspapers, but this guy, Craig Byler, says, actually, I think the fire started above, in the overhang of this alcove. And he says that it could be an electrical fire, but the original investigators basically just barely looked for any evidence. So there's really no way to rule out that it was an electrical fire or not. And if you can't rule out a cause of the fire, then you can't definitively say that it started on these newspapers. So it's basically casting doubt on the entire theory of the case. And the other thing is the original investigator says it had to have been a flammable liquid like gasoline, because there are these marks on the wall they call alligator charring blisters, because they kind of look like scaly alligator skin. And he said basically, if a fire is really hot, it will make really large blisters. But if the fire doesn't burn for very long, then the blisters will be very shallow. And he said that's what happened here. So what it shows is that the fire was basically really hot, and it couldn't have gotten that hot in such a short period of time unless there was like a liquid, flammable liquid like gasoline. And this, again, is just complete junk. There's no science backing this up. No one would testify to this today. And the district attorney's office, Essex County, has actually conceded that this original testimony at Carver's trial is junk. But they're basically saying, we still think we have enough evidence, so we don't want to give him a new trial. And that's kind of where we are today.
Wow. That's a lot. And it's another example that investigators and prosecutors don't necessarily go with the truth. They go with what's convenient for many reasons. This is me talking. So sorry if I'm sorry if this is wrong, but my initial gut is these people that are in these positions, either they want results so they can move their career along, or it's just like any other job, or worst case scenario, it's malicious and vindictive. And to me, it just sounds like people don't want to do their damn job.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess you have to sort of separate it into two buckets, because the original prosecutor has nothing to do with the case anymore. He's retired.
Right.
And with him, there was definitively misconduct by this prosecutor. He covered up evidence.
Mhm.
And it's not a case where you can just say that, oh, well, it was an accident. I thought I had given them everything, but I didn't. Because in this case, what happened was they had a witness who was interviewed by the police multiple times, and she made contradictory statements. She they talked to her once, and then they talked to her again about some more stuff, but they went over the stuff that she had already said, and her story like completely changes. And so they had a report that had the contradictory statements, but they just rewrote it and cut all that stuff out and gave them the this doctored report that had stuff edited out. And there's no way that happens by mistake, right? Like, you can't take out the stuff that's inconvenient for you out of a report and give them the rest of it and be like, oh, I cut all that stuff out by mistake, right? Like,
Mhm.
that is clearly deliberate, and that's why this mistrial happened. But then you have to look, I guess, the sort of motivations, I guess, of the people working on the case now are different. But I think a lot of what goes on in these old cases is, it's like people don't want to admit that they might have made a mistake, you know?
Yeah.
Like, if this happened, like 35 years ago, we got the bad guy, and now some lawyer from the Innocence Project wants to come along and say, oh, well, we didn't do a good job, and we just don't want to admit that that's possible. And uh what was really striking, like, you see this in wrongful conviction cases, and I just want to be clear, when I say wrongful conviction, I actually don't take a position on whether Carver is guilty or not. I think my position here is that's almost like the wrong question to ask. Like, the
Correct.
question is, did this guy get a fair trial? And if he
Mhm.
didn't, you either give him a new trial. And if you can't give him a new trial, then he's innocent until proven guilty. So so I'm not like definitively saying I know this guy is innocent. I've looked at the evidence probably closer than anyone other than the lawyers involved in the case have, and I'm not convinced he's guilty. But I am convinced that he didn't receive a fair trial. Um, but what struck me is, so there was actually a hearing about this where they presented all this new expert testimony about the science of fires and the science of eyewitness memory to a judge. And what really struck me was like the opening and closing statements from the prosecutor and from Carver's team were like totally different. Like, the uh the way that they opened and kind of closed for Carver was uh about like fairness and about whether or not justice was done. And the way the prosecutors sort of began and ended this hearing was basically like technicalities. We hear a lot about like, oh, the bad guy got off on a technicality. But like, in reality, all the technicalities in our legal system are sort of built around keeping people in prison. It's like
They favor the state.
yeah, so they literally opened this lawyer for the DA's office, Catherine Semmel, the assistant district attorney, opened this hearing by basically saying Carver took too long to bring this evidence to court, like almost saying that it doesn't matter that he's might be innocent, like that just, well, you waited too long, and it's hard for us to disprove your allegations because you should have brought them earlier and given us more time to counter your case. And kind of ended on like a very similar note um, about this kind of thing. Whereas Carver's lawyers were focused very much on like fairness and the idea that if you have evidence, that a jury should be listening to that evidence. And I think those are sort of like night and day positions. And I don't want to like psychoanalyze the prosecutors, but I do think maybe there's like an element of sort of like lawyer brain. It's like, well, I represent the DA's office, and I'm going to do I'm going to represent the DA's position, instead of thinking about, is this a good use of our resources to try to keep a 60-year-old man who needs a wheelchair to get around, because he had a brain tumor removed like a number of years ago, keep him in prison for something we have like very little evidence he may have even done. It's basically all circumstantial evidence at this point. There's like, when I looked at the hearing, there's almost no evidence that this fire could have like even been an arson. It's all completely circumstantial. And I just came away from it like, how does anyone think this is a good use of resources, you know?
Of course. And this is something like Joanna beats this drum. Like, okay, you think people are like, we think it's weird baseline that people's first thought is punishment. Like, how are we going to punish these people? How are we going to harm them and make them pay? And we think that's weird, but take that out, or like, fine, let's even agree that you need that. That's something you need. The amount of money and resources spent on shit like this, it's like the really obvious stuff is when, you know, you look at the cops promoting, you know, two special teams, interdepartmental, you know, Mass State Trooper and Abington Police find drugs, and it's like $500 worth of drugs, maybe a handgun that's like pretty beat up, worth $400. Like, it's like, really, guys? Like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point talking about. I sort of see this case as almost like a microcosm of everything that's wrong with America, because it's like we have all these problems where it's just so obvious we need like massive investments in like housing or healthcare, etc. And instead, we put all the money into like cops and prisons and stuff. And here you have a case where they had a 5-year like investigation to put this guy away, and now, you know, 35 years later, they've got to defend this case when there's all this new evidence undermining the original case. And meanwhile, if you look back at what started all this, it was a fire where people died. And do you know what could have saved the lives of all those people? Not a prison, but if they had put sprinklers in this building, if they had enclosed the staircase to the building and had an open staircase, meaning when you get to the top of the staircase, there isn't like another wall with a doorway. Yep. It just goes straight into the building. So what happened here, they believe,
shotgun effect.
Yeah, is that when the fire starts outside, it gets sucked in, and there's nothing stopping it. It just shoots through the building. Yeah, and it was an old wooden building, wood frames. It was there were no fire stops in the walls, so once the fire gets in the walls, it can just go through the entire building. And this is all stuff like when people think we talk about the idea of public safety, right? And public safety basically means cops, it means prisons, but really a lot of what constitutes safety is just, you know, safe housing, safe workplaces, places where it's not going to burn down, people aren't going to get mistreated or abused. It has very little to do with guys with guns showing up and slapping the handcuffs on the bad guy and sending them away to prison for life, or like junk. So
think about like if local government like Holyoke actually spent money on the building department, for example, and they actually code enforced, and there were programs that people with lower income or even landlords that say they can't, you can give them a 0 interest loan, and fucking, hey, you need to do the infrastructure upgrades on this property right now. Like, this is a, like you said, public safety issue.
Yeah, and back in the day, they didn't have to have sprinklers in this building. They didn't have to close off. They didn't have to enclose the staircase, and this building was actually considered up to code, even though apparently, if you look back at the newspaper articles from the time, everybody thought it was like a fire trap, and there had been fires reported at this building that, you know, they didn't escalate, they were just little things, but there was like a sense that this building could burn down someday, and it could be a real tragedy, and that's exactly what happened. And even even if we take sort of, was this arson or not, like if we take for granted that it was arson, for example, if you have a safe building, the arson probably isn't gonna like kill everybody. If somebody just lights a news, you know, if somebody just starts a little fire outside the entrance, it's probably not going to spread and burn down the whole building if you have the proper safety precautions in place, even if it is deliberate. And then maybe you do arrest the person afterward. But the point is that you can't put all your eggs in one basket and just assume that if enough guys with guns are going to stop tragedies from happening, if you ignore all the other, fundamental safety issues.
Yeah, you can't shoot fire and you can't shoot flooding.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, no, but it's true though. Like when just I hope people think about safety in that way, that like it's about more than good guys versus bad guys. It's about humans versus nature, like you can't arrest fire. You've got to prevent it. You've got to take precautions. And the fire department got to this place probably within a few minutes of it starting. There was, and we like to badmouth cops. I'll just say there were some cops who did some pretty heroic stuff at this fire. There was a guy named Dwayne Hathaway who was the first person on scene. He saw the fire. He raced there. He was trying to get people out of the building. He had no safety equipment. He was like inhaling smoke, like going up the fire escape, trying to get people, warn them, wake them up because it's happening at like 4 a.m. People are asleep. He's trying to get people out of there. He actually breathed in a lot of smoke and, got injured from it. So obviously we need first responders who are going to show up to things like this, but we also need prevention. And we can't just like arrest people after the fact.
Right.
But, there is, again, a serious question about whether this was even arson. At this hearing, I mentioned Craig Byler. He's the fire safety engineer who was for Carver's legal team. I don't want to say they hired him because I don't actually know whether they're paying him or not, or if he's volunteer, but he, like I said, he's an engineer, does he's like a scientific background. And he basically said the original people who looked at this building, they didn't do enough to rule out that it could have been like an accidental fire. He said, like, one example he gave is they had there's pictures of this building after the fire, and the entrance where the fire started has these wires hanging down. And the investigator who looked at it said that basically he looked at the wires and he bent them and they were still flexible. And so that meant that they hadn't dried out from the fire and gotten brittle, basically. So the fire couldn't have started inside the wires. And Craig Byler basically said, no, that's like junk. That's like literally not how electrical fires work. So this is not evidence that these wires weren't involved in the fire at all. And just to jump back again, so there are actually sort of like 3 people. There was a state trooper who looked at the building first, and then he had an electrician look at it. And then this guy who I mentioned flexing the wires, he was a guy they flew in from New York who was like the more experienced guy. And the first 2 people, the state trooper, like just sort of ignored the idea that it could have been an electrical fire in his assessment, because he said there were no wires near the ground. These wires were hanging off the ground, which, I mean, first of all, you don't know whether they were on the ground before the fire started or not. But even discounting that, he's basically assumed that the fire started on the ground. So if the wires aren't on the ground, they couldn't have been involved. But he did bring in an electrician, and then the electrician kind of went through the part of the building, but he didn't even look at the wires. Like, his report doesn't even mention them. And then you have the third guy I mentioned, who's all he does is bend the wires and go, yeah, it seems like they're probably okay. And the Craig Byler, the engineer, he was mentioning that, like, when you look at how a fire started, you have to take into consideration the pre-fire conditions, which might not be obvious after, because the building is damaged, right? The damage to the damaged building does not tell you necessarily how the building was before the damage, right? So like he points out maybe there was a light up there, because entrances to buildings usually have lights because people need to like see the keyhole. They need to find their keys if it's dark out, but there's no light. So he's like, well, they should have looked for a light. But if you look at their reports, there's no evidence that they searched the debris for a light. There's no evidence that they like looked behind the paneling to see for more like wires. They didn't trace any of the wires to the circuit breaker. We don't even know whether the building had like a circuit breaker because they didn't even check. And this is all basic stuff that you would do if you're trying to check the electrical system. You have to find the devices. You you look at the wires, you trace the wires back to the circuit breaker, you check the circuit breaker, you've got to take photographs of them close up from like, a few inches away, you trace the wires back, you have to document everything every step of the way, and then you have to preserve all those artifacts, bring them to a lab, look at them under a microscope, try to find out if they could have been responsible for a fire. And they didn't do any of that. Like they basically just kind of eyeballed it and were like, yeah, we don't think this was an electrical fire. And I think a lot of that has to do with, I mentioned like this whole myth about the charring, where they look at the char marks and they go, oh, that had to have been a flammable liquid. And if you've already decided that a flammable liquid was used, there's not really any reason to sort of investigate whether it was an electrical fire or not. Cause so they didn't really do any of this stuff, but that means that we don't actually have any evidence for how the fire started. But the DA's office presented their own expert witness at the hearing, who's a state trooper, former state trooper, I should say.
Junk science.
Well, he was a fire investigator, and what's interesting, he agreed with them that there's no evidence a flammable liquid was used, but he basically still said the original conclusion that it started on the newspapers was correct. But he didn't really have any proof. Like he basically, his case was more like Craig Byler, the engineer, is saying this isn't physically possible. And in fact, he cited some studies which said you would need like, say you have a wood walls and you go into the corner and you start a fire there. You would need like a fire that was like 5 feet tall that burned for like a little while, not just like a few seconds, but like a sustained period of time before the fire would actually spread to the walls, right? So like if you think about like holding a lighter up to like a block of wood, right? You might get some black on the wood, right? But it's not going to like set the whole thing on fire, right? Like you're not going to have like a blazing block of wood that's like totally engulfed in flames. So think about the same principle here. He says you set a bundle of newspapers on fire, you're going to get maybe not even a foot high fire. It's going to burn out in a few seconds because you'll get the edges of the papers on fire. But then kind of once the edges have burned off, the flame's going to fizzle out. And it's just not going to spread to the walls. And he had scientific studies for the amount of like the power of the size of the fire you would need for it to be powerful enough to spread to walls in a corner. And this guy, Michael Mazza, the investigator, who is a former state trooper, basically said, well, in the alcove, the smoke would kind of build up and it would make the fire hotter. And if you put it in the corner, that's going to make the fire hotter too. So it's going to make it bigger and it's going to be easier to spread. And these studies aren't really relevant because they weren't like in an alcove like this. And he didn't really have any science to back up anything though. And the other thing is he didn't have any sort of definitive reason for saying that the newspapers were responsible. It was more just that like it was possible. And so he was going with that explanation. Like his explanation for the electrical stuff is, well, they didn't find any evidence of like electrical devices that could have caused the fire. But that's a completely, it doesn't mean anything when it's said in response to they didn't look for that stuff, right? Like Craig Byler's saying they didn't look for this stuff, and he's saying, well, they didn't find anything. And it's sort of meaningless, right? Like if you don't look for something, then of course you're not going to find it. If you don't look for a light on the ground that could have fallen off the ceiling, then you're not going to find it. And so I sat through this hearing and I was just not impressed by the state trooper's testimony. I thought that Craig Byler made a lot of important points about this, about the weakness of this original case. And I've written a lot more about it. If you read the articles I've written, it gets into a lot more depth. But I just think it's an example of like why courts need to be really careful about admitting like so-called science. Like we have this problem in the law where law is based on like precedent, which means if we did it this way before, that's how we're going to do it, like, but in like science, that's not a justification saying, well, we've always done it this way. Yeah, well, if a new study comes along and says you're wrong, then you're wrong. Like, you don't just say, you can't just be like, well, I'm citing precedent and therefore I'm right. Like if the study proves you're wrong, you're wrong. But that's just not how courts work. Like they work slowly, and once you're convicted, it's very hard to overturn your case.
Right. And this is so I'll make sure everybody listening, I'll post all the relevant links to articles Andrew's written regarding this. And the thing I can't help but notice, like you brought up, like how they bring in a cop as a scientific expert, and I laughed because, like you said earlier, they don't get education like that. They're not doing peer-reviewed things.
Well, I mean, this police officer, to be fair, his education would be more up to date than like the guy who was testifying in the 80s. Like I think he knows more than that guy did. But yes, he's not like an engineer.
But the fact that he was like willing to be like, yeah, like he basically admitted, yeah, we go on our gut hunch and we work.
Well, he didn't say it like that, but that's how it reads to me, because he didn't actually, like when I sort of went through his testimony, it's very obvious he had there's nothing definitive in what he said. He's basically just saying this is possible, and he goes with that explanation. And I think the prosecution tried to sort of like make a false equivalence between Craig Byler and Michael Mazza, the state trooper, and basically say that, oh, well, you're making all these like definitive statements about what you think happened and blah blah blah, and that's the same as this guy making his conclusions. But the thing about Craig Byler is he basically didn't say, I know how the fire started. He said, I don't think the fire started on the floor, because that's not physically possible based on scientific research about how fires spread. So I can say it didn't start there, but I don't actually know how it started. He's not making like super definitive claims. He's not saying, I know it was an electrical fire. He's just saying, based on the evidence we have, we don't have enough to say how the fire started. And, in a criminal case where, beyond a reasonable doubt, if you can't prove where the fire started and you can't prove that it was an arson, that's obviously incredibly significant.
Yeah, what I was getting at, and you more articulately got to, but I think about how they're not trained in a way. They work from their gut conclusion, like the most probable Occam's razor thing. Well, they have beef, and this guy has a history. He's in a halfway house or whatever you want to call it, and they're adding all this stuff up, and it's kind of like they know of all these facts because they know the facts because they've needed to use a fact to prove their conclusion. You know what I mean? Like, well, this actually happened. And I'm sure sometimes that logic works out where, yeah, the most obvious thing that happened. And, but they don't enter any scenario like you mentioned with a scientist approach or engineering approach where you like literally you set your parameters. Like, do they have a circuit breaker? Where do these wires go? Just like they would, even just before they start making any conclusions, they just start just trying to define the crime scene. Like, and like with the Karen Reed thing, it's the same thing. It's like the cops like very shittily worked backwards, and that's what everybody's really kind of upset about. Not everybody's articulating it that way, but it's kind of like it's really obvious. Like they just like, well, we think this is what happened and we're going that way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what's kind of scary about the arson situation is that you showing that a case is arson is like 50% of the case, right? Like you have a fire and then you decide, was this arson or not? And if you say yes, then it's like, okay, well, if it was arson, somebody had to have done it. And then it's just picking the person who must have done it based on whatever evidence you can find. And there is some stuff in this case, like I mentioned earlier that one of the residents, his name was Rick Nickerson. James Carver, there is a lot of evidence for this, that he had some kind of beef with this guy, and he basically threatened him the night before the fire and said, like, I don't want you dating my ex-fiance. And he made some kind of threat. It's not really clear what the threat was because the witnesses who were there kind of gave differing accounts. But like it could have just been a coincidence, like this is like a 20-year-old guy, getting into a thing about a girl, and maybe it's stupid or whatever, but it happens. It doesn't mean he's going to actually go out and kill the guy
and kill 14 other people.
Yeah, and 14 other people. But if the guy does die the next day, obviously it looks really bad for him. And if they've decided that it's an arson, he's going to be a suspect.
Right.
But if
you got to prove it's arson.
Right. Yeah. But that's 50% of the case. So you actually have to show that it's arson. But there just isn't really, based on my assessment of the evidence, there isn't really that much evidence at all that this was arson or even could have been arson. And the other thing you mentioned is his lawyers have raised is the eyewitness stuff. There was a cab driver who drove by the building who said in court that he testified that he was asked, is that the guy you saw outside the building, like a short time before the fire? And he said, yeah, like that's him. But this is like a classic wrongful ID case. Like this is something, we know a lot more about eyewitness testimony now because of in the same year that James Carver was convicted, 1989, someone was had their case overturned for the very first time because of DNA evidence. And we sort of knew a lot about the problems of eyewitness testimony before then. But since then, it's become like impossible to ignore. And there's been a lot more research because we have cases where you had people say, that was the guy. I know it was him for sure. I saw his face. That couldn't have been anyone else. But then DNA proves it literally just couldn't have been that person. So we know that people make mistakes. And we've learned more about why those mistakes happen. And a lot of it has to do with just like bad police work, which is evident in this case. They had this cab driver and they showed him like what's called a photo array, which is, if you think about a police lineup, and it's like a police lineup with pictures. You've probably seen it on like Law and Order or whatever. They're like, which of these people was it?
They give you a whole bunch and they try to throw you off. They're trying to prove that you don't have a bias type stuff.
Yeah. So first of all, they didn't show, it was like a month and a half before they showed the guy the photo array. And it's something like after, like, I want to say about 3 weeks or so, it's almost completely unreliable to show a person a photo array. Like they will almost, they're like extremely likely to pick a wrong person. Mm-hmm. And so that's a problem right there. But then it gets worse because the guy picks someone who is not a suspect. And then he picks James Carver after. So he's picked two people and he didn't even pick James Carver first. And he says, I think it's one of these two guys here. So it's not even clear that he's actually picked someone. It seems like he's basically just guessing. This is all in the police records from the time. And he also said in his testimony, it took him like 20 minutes to pick the photos. And if you think about, like, if you see someone, you just immediately, like, you don't even have to think about it. It's instantaneous. You just recognize the person's face. If it's like a stranger, maybe you're like, is that them? Yeah, it's them. But it only takes like a second or two, right?
Right.
This guy spent 20 minutes staring at, like I think 8 or 9 different photos. And finally he picks two of them and goes, it's one of these two here. And then over the next few years, they show him the same photo array 2 more times. And he keeps picking these 2 pictures. And he says that he basically comes up with this explanation that James Carver is the guy he saw, but his hair was longer the morning of the fire, and it looked kind of like this other guy's hair. So he picked the other guy first, but then he comes up with this explanation that, oh, I only picked this guy because his hair kind of looked like the guy that I saw, but not because I actually thought it was him.
Mhm.
So he's like changed his story and sort of like almost just confabulated this explanation for why he picked the two pictures, but he keeps picking these two pictures. And finally, the police show him a in-person lineup. So the fourth time they've done one of these procedures to have him identify someone, and James Carver is there, but the guy that he kept picking for the hair or whatever isn't there. So he doesn't have to like differentiate between these two people. And he even said during the third photo array, he's like, said something in the effect of, I've been having trouble with these two pictures, but he doesn't have trouble with them during the lineup because they just didn't include the guy he kept picking. And you know, I don't think that other guy like started the fire or anything, or that he was there. It's just that this guy's testimony isn't reliable. And there were like signs in some of the like instructions that they gave him that they were kind of encouraging him to pick someone even if he didn't see the person. And there's other concerning things about this. Like, he provides a description to the police about like a week after the fire, and he says that the guy's wearing a shirt that says "Make It in Massachusetts," which was like some tourist thing that they used to do. But then James Carver, who becomes a suspect, turns over his clothing from the morning of July 4th to the police, and he's got overalls on. And if you're wearing overalls, you can't read the shirt, right? So how could he have been wearing a shirt that said "Make It in Massachusetts" if it's being blocked by the overalls? Well, guess what? Like a little bit shortly after that, they bring the cab driver back in, and he says, oh yeah, I remember that he was wearing overalls, and that's why I wasn't like 100% sure what the shirt said. So he's coming up with this new information after the police have decided that it's part of their theory of the case, essentially, right? Which is just clearly suspicious. And it's also like not how human memory works. Like, your memory is fresh after something happens, but the more time goes on, the less you remember. You don't like remember new stuff that you couldn't remember before. That's not how memory works. And the other thing is, he says, I saw James Carver's car outside the building, which it was a pretty distinctive car. It's like a Mercury Cougar, like a light blue color. So it's like a luxury car. You're not going to see too many of them. But when he first talked, when he first talked to the police, though, this guy just says, I saw a blue car. And then they talk to him again, and he's like, oh yeah, it was either like a Mercury Cougar or a Ford Torino, which I think apparently looks kind of similar. And over the years, he keeps adding more distinctive features, like, oh, it had damage to the front grille, and like stuff like that. It had these like special hubcaps that weren't like from the factory. They're like a thing that you would have had to put on yourself. Like, they're called spoked, or not, they're called mag wheels. They're like a spoked hubcap that wouldn't have been like factory standard. And he didn't mention any of this stuff to the police at first. It's only after he's had numerous interactions with the police that suddenly he's describing more and more features of James Carver's car. So it just reeks of influence by the police, which it may have not been intentional. It may have just been...
No, it's just cops being cops.
Yeah, it may have been like, well, them asking something like, well, did the car have mag wheels on it? And he's like thinking about it. He's like, sure, why not? I guess so. And they're like, okay, let's run with it. I mean, I don't know what happened because I wasn't there. There's no recordings of any of this stuff. That's kind of a problem with some of these older cases, is like, you know, nowadays it's more common to record stuff like this so you can tell whether a witness is being influenced or not. We don't have any of this stuff from a case from, you know, the mid to late 80s. But it fits the pattern of, you know, police influence. And it just raises a lot of questions about, first of all, it's just clear that this witness isn't reliable. And like more broadly, it just raises questions about the whole investigation, about just sloppy police work in general, and how they might have, you know, they call it like tunnel vision. The cops decide what their theory of the case is, and then they look for the evidence to prove that, but they don't like consider other alternatives, right?
And the most tragic thing is there's 15 dead and potentially a man's life ruined, and resources that have been used to punish this person, and then also the resources even now being spent, like currently still, to keep him there, when we could just give him housing, Medicare, and Social Security, and he could just retire. Like, it would be just way cheaper all across the board. It's fucking insane. It's like, even if he did this, isn't 40 years enough? Like, what are we doing? How much
Yeah,
more
and
do
I
you
mean,
need?
and this guy, it's interesting, James Carver, he was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole because it's second degree murder. Um, but he has not gone for parole before. And according to his lawyers, it's because he just feels like if he went before the parole board, they would want him to admit that he was guilty and say, I'm sorry. And he just won't admit to something that he says he, is innocent of. And he did go for medical parole, which is also sometimes known as compassionate release,
Yep.
which is basically, I'm so disabled that, I'm not a danger to public safety anymore. And he's in a wheelchair. Like when I was in court every day, they had to wheel him in to court. He has hearing aids because he has I believe he's completely deaf in one ear and has like a lot of hearing loss in the other ear, so he had to wear like a headset in court to hear what was going on.
Mhm.
I mean, he just looks like a feeble old man, and even if he's guilty, he clearly poses no risk to anyone. And he went up for medical parole, and I don't know if this stuff is current because this was like a few years ago. He had like cancer at the time, in addition to just all these like mobility issues and hearing loss, and he has tremors. So like it's not he first of all he's in the wheelchair. He can stand up sometimes, but he still needs like a lot of help. Like when he gets tremors, like he won't be able to feed himself or like change his clothes when he gets these tremors. So he has a ton of these health problems, and they denied his compassionate release, and he actually went to court over it. And what's interesting is the same judge who heard his motion for a new trial heard his medical parole and denied it. So same judge, um, which I, I don't know. It's interesting, and I want to say I think this judge is probably, from what I can tell, giving him like a fair shake in um, this other hearing. I think that having his medical parole denied by this judge might be more a case of the medical parole law not being strong enough to let people out of prison unless they're like totally completely like incapacitated to the point where they like can barely do anything. This judge, uh I'm blanking on his name. I feel bad because I know what it is. It's
Yeah.
let me grab it from the story. It's Jeffrey Karp. He he heard this, and he was asking tough questions of both sides, but it was clear to me. It's not clear to me how he's going to rule, but it's clear to me that he was really considering this. And he said at one point, the the DA's office basically admitting that this stuff about like the char marks not being proof that a flammable liquid was used to start the fire. He said he's like, this is a really significant concession by the DA's office. Like I think he was troubled by that. Like I think he's really considering how this science impacts things. And I have no idea how he's going to rule, but I know that he is thinking about this. And this hearing ended in I think April. It was like 4 days.
April
Or no,
9th.
it, it was a few days in April, and then I believe one day in, was it in, hold on, I think it was in May. Um, yeah, it was a one day in May to like sort of do some other legal stuff. Um, but he, he listened very intently. He's taking a lot of notes. He's asking a lot of questions. He seemed really interested in the facts of this case. And like before the hearing started at a different proceeding, he was saying he was like kind of eager to get into this because he said he considers himself like a forensic geek and he wanted to like learn about all this fire stuff. So he really is thinking about this stuff. But like the gears of the court system turn slowly. So we don't really know. Yeah, we don't really know when this guy is going to rule. Like it could be next week, could be a few months from now. It could take like a whole year.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where we're at right now. We're just, James Carver and his lawyers are waiting to see what happens, and I'm waiting to see what happens.
Well, keep us updated, and of course, like if you follow us on social media, we always update when we see stuff like that. So Twitter, Instagram, etc. We're getting better at using Substack, so you can always go to our Substack to find Andrew, but we're also going to include those links in the show notes as always at www.theweedout.com, and in your pod player you can just look down the show notes. Andrew, sorry,
let me get to one more thing. Actually, we didn't get to this.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'll go into all the details, but I do just for people's understanding of how kind of like screwed up this whole case was. I mentioned James Carver has two lawyers now who are these like sort of innocence lawyers who have been, working with him in the past few years to present all this new evidence. He had a different lawyer at trial back in the 80s named Dennis Jackson. And what is significant about Dennis Jackson is, where do I start? The first thing is, while Dennis Jackson was representing James Carver, he had a serious substance use problem. He was addicted to cocaine and alcohol. And he takes on Carver as a client, and before Carver's first trial, he's not, Jackson isn't in court, doing a lot, but it still matters at this point, because when you have especially a serious case like this, where, somebody's freedom is on the line for their entire life, you've got to be investigating that case, getting all the facts, talking to witnesses, getting everything. During this time period, according to Jackson's own words, he was spending $500 like a week on cocaine. And this is $500 in like the mid 80s. So probably at least double that, like think about like $1,000 or like $1,200 a week on cocaine. That's a lot of cocaine, dude. Like, and he was apparently, so let me jump ahead a little bit.
Sorry. I don't mean to be quibble about, I mean, I smoke weed and I've done drugs. Like, I'm not a Puritan about it. Not to laugh at people's drug addictions. It's a dark place to be.
No, and I
I know you do. I just laugh really like viscerally, like, oh, the crypto cocaine. Like, it's not something to be admiring either. It's actually really sad.
No, I agree. And here's the thing: is I'll get into this in a second, how I have so much detail about this, but I have a lot of detail about this guy's addiction, and it felt a little weird writing about it because it feels kind of like invasive to talk about something so personal. But it's important for this story because he wasn't just some guy. He was a lawyer representing someone who's in prison for life, and he had a responsibility to his client that is something most people don't have, like someone's life is on the line. There are people like that, like a doctor or whatever, who, if they're, doing $500 a week of cocaine while they're operating on people, you might want to know that, right? It might be sad, but you probably don't want that guy operating on you. The way I know this is shortly after, so James Carver, I mentioned, had two trials. Shortly after the first trial, Dennis Jackson, the defense attorney, is in a car accident, where single car accident. So he like crashed into a whole bunch of stuff, Like he just veered off the side of the road. The information I have is that he basically fell asleep at the wheel after he left court for a different client, and the he's uh, he's prosecuted for both driving under the influence of alcohol and drugs. And from the information I have, it sounds like he wasn't drinking. It sounds like he had been using cocaine. Um, and they had done, I believe, like a blood test on him at the hospital that found traces of cocaine. And there were people at the court who, shortly before he left, kind of observed him being like incoherent. Um, so this basically put him in the crosshairs of what's called the Office of Bar Counsel. This is the state entity that sort of prosecutes, not like criminally prosecutes, but like it's like a misconduct board. Like if you think the post commission for police, this is like the post commission for lawyers, basically. If a lawyer does professional misconduct, then they're gonna like, do something about that. But it's sort of divided into two parts. You have the Office of Bar Counsel, which is sort of like the prosecution, and then the Board of Bar Overseers is like sort of the court, I guess, to use an analogy. They're not like an actual court. They're just like they have the hearing and they decide what to do in terms of imposing discipline. So they had a hearing about this guy, but not until after Carver was represented by Dennis Jackson in his second trial and found guilty. But while Dennis Jackson is representing Carver during the second trial, he's facing his own charges, and he gets the plea deal shortly after Carver is convicted. And then he has to do time himself. He does like 30 days of like a 2 or 2.5 year sentence. So he's actually sentenced to jail himself. But anyway, the Board of Bar Overseers eventually, a few years later, takes away his law license. And it turns out, so not only did he get into this one accident, but he's using drugs and alcohol constantly. And he testifies about this in detail because he was sort of had this defense that, I had an addiction, but I'm dealing with it. And like, I'm better now and I can represent people. And so some of his testimony could be self-serving because he's talking about how he stopped using drugs and alcohol at various points in time. And there were things calling into question the truthfulness of some of the things he said. So according to him, he like wasn't using drugs at the time that he represented Carver, like during the actual trial, but he was at least in the lead up to the first trial, and he was in between the two trials when he got into the car accident. So we know that at least at the time when he's supposed to be preparing for the case, he's using drugs. And he wasn't just using drugs like, like you're right. I cocaine, whatever, it's illegal, but people like will go out, they'll party, they'll do cocaine, and then they'll, maybe once in a blue moon, and then life will go back to normal for them or whatever. But this guy was using it constantly, and he said he would call these things called party lines, which were like these pay by the minute phone things where you would talk with a bunch of strangers, and he would basically do a bunch of cocaine, stay up all night, call these places and just talk to people all night. And then he would be exhausted the next day and he wouldn't go into work. He'd show up late. He'd cancel meetings for clients. And he was basically like a wreck. And it's just hard to believe that this guy should be representing people in a murder case of all things when he has this personal problem. Like, again, it's not to attack him as a person. It's to say that people who are facing these kind of charges, the system has a responsibility to provide them with a good defense and with someone who can provide that defense. But then it gets even crazier than that because James Carver has tried to overturn his conviction several other times. And one of the previous times, he was represented by a different lawyer. And this lawyer alleged that Jackson, the initial trial lawyer, had an inappropriate sexual relationship with James Carver's wife while representing him. And this woman was married to him throughout his two trials. They later divorced after he was convicted. but they were married at the time he's on trial. And she testified that he basically invited her to his place, showed her pornographic movies, asked her to perform oral sex on him, and would call her and like masturbate on the telephone. Um, and a judge basically said she didn't find the ex-wife's testimony credible because she and James Carver had a kid together, and there was like a custody dispute with her and James Carver's parents. And the judge basically thought that she's testifying because she wants the parents to give her the kid back, and she's trying to help them out essentially. Now, maybe in a vacuum, that would a judge would think that, but there's more to this because it turns out that Dennis Jackson was harassing like young girls and women by calling them on the phone and claiming that he was like an amateur photographer and he wanted them to model for him to complete his portfolio. And in some cases, he allegedly made like sexual advances toward them. And these were like 16 and 17-year-old girls. And he eventually like faced criminal charges for doing this. And this became a thing at his disciplinary hearing where two of these girls testified about it and how he was like approaching them and calling them on the phone. And another girl she didn't testify at the hearing, but there's police reports about this. She was the younger sister of a defense witness in the case. So think about like a pattern here. He's making advances towards the younger sister of some guy he's probably interviewed to testify in the case. He's maybe possibly making advances towards his client's wife. You know, one, you might think, yeah, this ex-wife is just trying to help to get her kid back or whatever. You add another person in, it starts to look like a pattern. And then when you have all these other girls saying he's doing creepy stuff, it sure seems like this guy was just a kind of a creep, you know? And it raises a lot of questions about like a conflict of interest with this client. Like, how can you represent someone if you're, you know, going behind that person's back in such a profoundly it's like backstabbing your client by doing this with their wife. You know, it's such a profound what am I trying to say? Their trust, you know, going
Betrayal.
against them, like a betrayal of their trust.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it just proves that you do not have their best interest because, you know, you're also coercing this person. Like maybe even if you know, is it consent, you know, because like she's in a delicate position. Like, you know,
Yeah.
does she want him to be in jail for the rest of his life? Even if they hate each other, probably not. You know, so like there's still that like, well, maybe I can grease the wheels a little bit, grease the wheels of justice, even worse, and that's coercion and that's gross.
Yeah,
And
and I mean, she didn't testify to that. She didn't say this guy took advantage of me or anything. But
of course,
like, so I don't want to say definitively that that's what happened, but I think it certainly seems
he has a
it's
power
exactly.
dynamic, and
There's certainly a power imbalance, and it's inappropriate, and it's
he should know
disgusting,
better.
and he should know better.
Yeah, he should.
And there was an age difference as well.
Oh,
They
of
were, I believe, might have been in her like young, like early to mid 20s, and he was, you know, in his like 30s or whatever.
Oh my god, this is some Better Call Saul shit.
uh, and yeah, the amount of stuff going on in this case where we didn't get to this part until the end. You know, it's just like
It's a travesty.
It's wild, and it gets me back to my point about like whether or not James Carver is guilty is not really the right question. It's like, was this fair? And how can anyone say this is fair? You have a compromised lawyer who's, you know, he's got like a personal he's compromised in a personal way. He's got a severe drug and alcohol problem that's probably affecting his ability to represent you. You have junk science that even the DA's office now says shouldn't have been admitted. You have like really egregious, like obviously invalid eyewitness testimony. You have prosecutorial misconduct that leads to a mistrial. It's got almost everything in there in terms of like red flags, like how can anyone say this is fair?
You don't have to fucking tell me twice. I know it's not fair, but yeah, we have to. Thank you so much for like digging in on this, because these stories need to be told, and it's right in our backyard. It's Massachusetts, and we see these people, we see these prosecutors in the news, and they're filing other cases as we speak, and it's like this throws and this is kind of the problem, I think, inherently. They don't want to undo this, because then precedent. Then we have to start looking at all the other cases that these same people mishandled. Possibly we have to we might have to fine tooth comb that, and how many cases with this prosecutor or this judge or whoever was involved, every case that lawyer was in, James Carver's lawyer, it's like
Yeah. Well, I mean, we already know that he basically represented several other people around that time frame and just didn't do anything and just kind of kept their money, and they had to this is part of he so we know that he did stuff in other people's cases. But you're right, I think that's actually a good point. Is just I want to draw like a parallel. Is in Massachusetts we've had these drug lab scandals, we had the breathalyzer thing with the state police, and we've had these cases where someone's misconduct has affected like thousands of cases, and they've thrown out like thousands of cases and said that we can't stand by this stuff anymore. But when it comes to they're able to do that because the misconduct can be pointed to like one source. You can say, we know that Annie Dukin did a bunch of shady stuff, so anything Annie Dukin touched is suspect, or Sonia Farrick, or we know that the Office of Alcohol Testing at the state police was doing some sketchy stuff and they weren't, calibrating these machines. So those are suspect. But when it comes to like forensic science more broadly, the court system doesn't approach it in the same way. It's all piecemeal. It's like, well, if you think there was invalid forensic science, you've got to bring it to court individually. You can't bring it as thousands of people. And the prosecutors are going to fight back, and they're going to say, well, in your case, maybe there was bad forensic science, but we have all this other evidence, so we should just ignore the bad forensic science and just assume that your trial would have come out the same way anyway. And which is kind of what's happening in Carver's case. But the bigger point is that you can have junk science like this that is used for years and years. Like, we don't even know how many people have been put away based on, alligator charring, or another thing that came up in Carver's case was smoke swirling stains, which supposedly also proved, a flammable liquid, even though it's just completely made up junk science. Or the idea that fire can't burn downward. How many other cases have been kind of tainted by this stuff, and we don't even know. There's never even been an effort to find out, but I'm sure it's more than one. There was another case, Victor Rosario, who was exonerated a number of years ago. He had one of the same lawyers, Lisa Kavanaugh, was representing him, and like a year or two ago, he got I want to say it was like $13 million or something in a lawsuit. I'd have to double check. I can Google it super quick. He got a lot of money for a very similar thing where, it was just junk science that put him away. It was $13 million settlement. And which again, by the way, is another reason why they don't want these cases overturned, because they don't want to pay up the big bucks for violating people's civil rights. But there's more. This isn't just about James Carver. It isn't just about Victor Rosario. There's a lot of these cases probably, and because, like I said, these arson cases, if you've concluded it's arson, that's 50%. The other 50% is you need the person to pin it on. So if you've got all these cases that are hinging on this junk science, there could be a lot more people out there that just haven't managed to get legal representation. They haven't managed to, marshal a good case to get their case overturned, or they might just have died in prison already, so there's more people out here in Massachusetts and in other states, almost certainly, and there's no systemic way that this is being addressed. And I think that is as important as this individual story, is just remembering that it's not just about one person.
Well, you've just added another quiver in my arsenal because I've kind of even moved away from abolish the police personally. Like, obviously, ACAB, abolish the police and ACAB always, but I'm all about abolish the King's Court. It doesn't fucking make sense in modern times. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And yeah, why do we give a fuck what, XYZ? I don't know. We like, why are we using the same court system when we rebelled from the crown? Like, I don't understand that personally.
Well,
maybe you could rebut that thought process. I just get, because like you just made another argument in my opinion that's a good reason to get rid of this court system and start something different.
yeah, well, I mean, obviously that's not going to happen overnight. I think
No.
maybe someday. In the short term, though, I think we need a more proactive approach to looking at stuff like this, because like we just know that there's more cases like this out there. I mean, like, there's people every year who are having their cases overturned because of junk science, because of prosecutorial misconduct or police misconduct, because of phony or bad eyewitness testimony, for lots of reasons. We have massive injustices like the drug lab scandals, which are affecting thousands of people. We just know that there are these problems, and we need at least someone out there who's like looking into these things and isn't gonna just wait for some people from the Innocence Project or whatever to find a
Notice
case
their
35 years
extreme
after the
story.
fact. And yeah,
And it's an
it's
extreme story. It's like a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, like the numbers we can't see, they don't have all these juicy tidbits. It's the same thing that frustrates me about the Karen Reed stuff. It's like, I'm glad you guys are paying attention. I am so fucking glad. And you're seeing how fucking dumb this shit is. And then how do you not, like, you'll spend all this time and energy, and there's little influencers that are like getting careers off of dissecting this one case. And they're refusing to like be like, there's a gold mine here across the board, the whole system. There's cases like this everywhere.
yeah, it's funny. A funny anecdote is, I remember while I was working on this story quietly, because I was doing tons of research on this, digging up court records and newspaper articles and stuff. I spent, there's so much stuff in here. I haven't even read every single piece of evidence, of documentation in this, because there's just so much. I've read enough though, and I've been to the hearings and court stuff. But while I'm working on this quietly, someone on Twitter who's like trolls me every once in a while was like tweeting at me, and this is before Karen Reed was on trial. It was like, oh, if you were an investigative journalist, you'd be looking into the Karen Reed case, but you're basically saying I'm a phony or whatever. And the reason I wasn't looking into the Karen Reed case is because there's lots of other cases with misconduct or junk science or stuff. I'm looking at a completely different case that involved tremendous amount of work for me to write these stories. And it was very funny to me, because it's like the Karen Reed case is certainly an important story, but it's not all about Karen Reed. There's all these other cases. And if everybody's looking at one case and pretending that it's the most important thing in the world, we're going to, miss the forest for the trees. And we're not going to get this bigger story, which is that stuff like this happens all the time. Like, there's injustices going on every day. There's injustices from decades ago that might never even be corrected because nobody's even going to notice that they happened. And it's hard. Like, these Innocence Project people will get cases and they're not sure always what to do with them. They can't always help these people, whether the person's innocent or not, just because there might be legal technicalities, or it might be that they believe the person's innocent, but the evidence just, when you get evidence, it can't just be evidence that was already presented at trial, or even evidence that was available at the time but wasn't presented. It has to be like, quote unquote, newly discovered evidence that wasn't available during the original trial, which is how this like scientific stuff can get in. But if they just went back and started saying, oh, well, the prosecutor did all this misconduct stuff, like, well, that's already been litigated, you know, like you need to come up with new stuff. So even if an injustice has happened, if it basically, if it's in the past, it gets forgotten about unless you can come up with some new juicy thing that is going to convince a judge to look at it.
Or you have the clout to get hold of a governor or the president, and you know, you can be a political win for you know, you can, I mean, we know Donald Trump sold pardons, so I mean,
like, yeah, you can get pardoned, but that's so rare. And you know, the thing about,
you have to admit guilt there too, right?
I don't know. I want to be fair, so I don't want to like misspeak, because I haven't followed everything Healey's done with the pardons. Maura Healey, our governor, but I do remember when she initially announced some pardons, they were like all for people who were already out of jail, and basically she was overturning their convictions to make it like easier for them to get jobs or housing, or for them, you know, to stay in the country if they're an immigrant, which is all well and good. You know, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but like, I think the pardon power doesn't mean a lot unless you're willing to do the, you know, be the leader and say, this person's in prison, but I'm going to let them out, you know. And if somebody's already been living on the outside of prison and has gotten their life back on track, and you're just going to say, oh, well, I'll give you the pardon now, and that's the only time you're willing to use the pardon power. I don't think that kind of goes far enough in terms of addressing the issue of, you know, injustice and mass incarceration, etc.
I mean, Maura Healey, I mean, I am very unhappy with her policies. But sorry, that's a different conversation for a different day. But yeah, like you got to have political clout in some capacity to go that route, and most people don't have that, I guess is my what I was getting at.
But just to bring it back around, though, there's a lot of cases like this. It takes a lot of work to look into one of these. Like, I'm not even the lawyer, but it took me, you know, I spent like 18 months working on this first story I did about this, and then I spent more time going to the hearings and stuff. There's a tremendous amount of information in this, and it's hard, and that's just one guy, and there's other guys like him. There's probably women like him as well who are just in prison based on, maybe they're innocent, and even if they're not, maybe they didn't they still weren't given a fair trial, because fairness is important whether the person's guilty or not. And we need whether we abolish the courts or whether we just tune them up, we need something's got to give. You know, it's not right the way things work, you know, right now. We need more to address this stuff about forensic junk science, and we need more like systemic approach to that, instead of just saying, hey, if you manage to get a couple lawyers who can dedicate years to your case, and, you know, maybe they'll eventually get you out of prison by the time you're in a wheelchair, and you know, if your health has deteriorated from being in prison for decades. But you know, that's the system we have.
Yeah, and just for people at home, the Weed Out does not think the answer is just to give more money to the court system.
And neither do I.
No, I didn't want to speak for Andrew, but I will just say, if you're asking what's the answer, I can tell you what one thing that's not the guaranteed answer, and that's not just give them more money. We need to rethink about what we're bringing people into the court system, into the justice system for, you know, for that's a quick policy fix. Like, yeah, we're not going to be too worried about drug possession. Like,
right. And I mean, to go beyond the drug possession example, in a case like this case, based on the evidence they had, probably shouldn't have been brought forward at all. But I mean, we have it backwards with the science in courts, where it's like, if you can get some guy who says, oh, I'm an investigator and I am an expert because I have done this for a really long time, and I'm just going to say a bunch of stuff that has no scientific evidence to back it up, like, oh, these marks on the side of the wall, they prove it was arson. that stuff, we need scientists to prove all that stuff before you bring it into court, instead of having them show up 35 years later and being like, yeah, this guy doesn't know what he was talking about. If you're going to bring a case like this, do the science first, don't have the defense do the science years later. And if that happened, maybe these cases wouldn't even be brought at all. Maybe they would be like, oh, this probably wasn't an arson, or we can't prove it was arson. Maybe we just need to put sprinklers in the buildings, and maybe we just need to close off those staircases, and maybe we need to put psychiatric patients in state housing instead of dumping them in a rooming house.
Or just more stable housing. It doesn't.
Sure.
Yeah,
housing first, and I mean, that's the real tragedy of this, is that we have answers to a lot of these problems. We just, and not me and Spencer, we're not doing this, but as a society, we just don't put the money where it should go. We put it into cops and prisons. And I think we're going to kind of segue, you were saying, into a sort of related topic. But let me just plug myself real quick before we do that.
We got to do that. We got to pin up the major discussion first. So remember, everybody can go to the website or in the podcast player. Any link that we mention, it's going to be there. Or you can just follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter, or X.
Yeah.
I don't know. And so please, Andrew, where can people find you?
So I have a Substack newsletter called The Mass Dump. You can Google it, or it's andrewqmr.substack.com. What is it? Q as in Quebec, M as in Michael, R as in
Richard.
Sure, why not Richard? And you can Andrew QMR on Twitter or X or whatever it's called, and those are probably the best ways to find me. And it's, again, The Mass Dump. I've got a whole bunch of stories about this. There was a 10,000 word piece I published before the hearing, and I've covered the hearing and the 40th anniversary of the fire. And I'll have more to say about this eventually. I'm kind of waiting for the opinion to drop from the judge, but it's been a really wild ride covering a story like this. And in some ways my work actually influenced it, because some of the stuff about the lawyer are documents I discovered, and it's just like, it's a little surreal to be like, wow, I put in the work, and now it's like reflecting back at me, it's
you're concerned about justice in your community, and you don't know this
like
guy.
It's like the opposite of that. It's like the opposite of that Nietzsche quote about you staring into the abyss. It's like stare into the light and it will be reflected back at you or whatever.
Well, I'm glad you actually got some sort of visceral, tangible, because now a lot of organizing or activism or just being a good human, it's invisible. And not to be corny, but it's as little as holding the door open for somebody to, whatever, anything, whatever acts of solidarity with other human beings you can do. But this case is kind of a big one, so it must feel good to actually hey, some things I uncovered became part of the court record that is going to help this guy possibly get out.
Yeah, or maybe it won't, but whether it does or not, the truth is out there, the facts are out there, and the state is going to have to deal with that. It's going to have to, those lawyers are going to have to know what they're doing, I guess. And, just sort of bearing witness to something like this is just, it's a wild feeling, I remember when I uncovered some of this stuff about the lawyer by getting the records from the disciplinary hearing. And I did share them with, his James Carver's lawyers, because it's not like I'm their private investigator or anything, but I'm not going to hide something of that significance from them. And I didn't really hear much about it, because they keep me at arm's length. They talk to me a little bit, but they're not they don't want to tell me too much. They've got to protect their attorney-client privilege, their legal strategy, etc. But I remember when they filed a supplemental court brief, and I remember seeing them I got halfway through it and they're talking about these records, and I was just like, holy shit, like something that I uncovered is like part of this now. And it was just like, wow, you know. Um, but it's not about me. I just mean that it's just something else to be like a part of it, even in like such a small way.
No, it's just a reminder to everybody listening that, any little thing you can do, it doesn't have to look exactly like Andrew is doing. But this is how we make right for the many wrongs that are we're all complicit in. Not to be, blunt about it, but like, we're all complicit. We pay taxes into the system, you know, and some people don't participate at all. Yada yada. But you can't control what other people do. You can only control what you do. And it's good to get a little bit of a win, especially in these bleak times. And it's not even a win per se, but well, the odds are stacked against you. We'll take any good news you can get. And this will segue into the crowd favorite, Ghoulery and Tomfoolery. Quick little segment we do at every show where I bring up usually a local headline and just kind of point out how ghoulish and tomfoolery-ish it is. And Andrew's a veteran. He's been on the show before, so he's familiar. I'm just going to read this Boston.com article headline. Healy announces major shelter systems change. Cap stays at overflow sites to 5 days. Certain families will be eligible for new prioritization inside the overburdened shelter system. So the basic gist, let me share this with the screen so Andrew can see it. All right.
I mean, I am generally okay. Here you go. I'm generally familiar with this.
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty standard. So yeah, basically, Maura Healey announced major changes to the state's emergency shelter system Tuesday in an effort to preserve space and money almost a year after declaring a state of emergency regarding this situation. And the situation, let's remember, everybody, are migrants seeking asylum.
And other homeless families and
et cetera. People in need, and they are not illegal. They're human beings, and they're in fucking need. And we're spending money on brutalizing drug users, on Millennium and Cass in Boston, and throwing them in jail and spending tons of money on that when we could just be housing fucking people. So she's just doing austerity. It's standard Maura Healey nonsense, and this is going to lead to all sorts of problems trickle down. So I guess since you're the guest, ghoulery, tomfoolery, or both, Andrew?
Well, so the thing is that like they're only letting them stay for like 5 days, right?
Mm-hmm.
to shelter, like in a state with a housing crisis. Like, how are you supposed to find housing in 5 days? It's like totally absurd. And she said something to the effect of like she doesn't want migrants to come to Massachusetts because there's no space for them. It literally.
She literally said,
if you change the name to Trump and like change it from Massachusetts to the United States, people would be pissed about that. But like, this is our supposedly liberal governor doing this. And this is something, my understanding is they've had this guarantee of shelter in place for, I don't know, I don't want to quote exactly how long, but for quite some time. And only now they've decided to change it. And how have they, it just is like, it's definitely ghoulery. I'll say that, but like to just deny people shelter is obviously wrong. And it goes back to what I was saying before about sort of like talking about the Carver case, how it's a microcosm of the problems in the United States, where we invest all this money in punishment and we're not investing in things like housing. And we should have space for migrants who show up. and she's talking about prioritizing, I think, veterans over migrants. Um, why do migrants even need shelter in the, or I'm sorry, why do the veterans who already, live in this country even need to be staying at like a shelter? Why don't they have housing for people? You know, we shouldn't have a housing crisis. We should be building more housing. We should be having policies in place to stop people from being evicted. We should have, possibly like public housing options. And we should be investing in those kinds of things more and less in, the machinery of punishment.
Yeah, so it's all the things really. It's foolery, it's tomfoolery. I mean, and to play these like word games for me, that's where I come in. Like we're gonna prioritize people that have no fault evictions, like fires or floods, and just like this picture right here where she looks concerned, and it's like this looks like a concentration camp, like like what the
Weren't they were talking about housing the migrants in like the jail that they're closing, right? Wasn't that something that was happening? Which is like, on the one hand, it almost, it just feels dystopian. Like, why do you have such poor housing options that you have to put people up in like an old jail? I mean,
right.
I guess maybe you could argue there's something positive about it, and the idea of like we're incarcerating fewer people and we're going to put those resources towards housing. But like, people shouldn't have to live in a jail, right?
And
Like,
the jail is specifically jail, prison, incarceration, even the minimum. They're designed to not be homey and comfortable. It's like
yeah,
it,
there's only so much you can
it-
do to renovate a jail and
yeah,
make it,
it's
a nice
still
place to live.
you're better off converting like a 1950s middle school into like housing, like because that at least has a little more character and hominess, like and not like oppressive structures where a prison is very like deliberately oppressive, like and that's the thing. It's like I mean, it really grinds my gears, and it's like we can't. There's a million things we could do, a million fucking things we could do, and this is the best they can come up with. And then they kind of shame people. And she said, "Do basically she did the Kamala Harris a couple weeks ago. Do not come. We're full." And it's like, oh, gross, man. Yeah, how is this
Yeah,
any
I mean,
different
how
than
and
what Trump
and
does?
how is Massachusetts full? We have like, we just need to build. We have so much space here for housing. We just haven't invested in the resources to make it happen. We have we need more public transportation so it's easier to get around the state, so we can get like people from Western Mass to Eastern Mass and vice versa. We need more housing in like some of the more rural areas. We can make Boston denser in a lot of places. um, there's no reason we can't have enough housing for everybody who already lives here, and that we can't be welcoming to other people who need a place to live. um, and to maybe let's make this tomfoolery instead of ghoulery. But did you see the thing from Shirley Leung in the Boston Globe? She was like a big proponent. She's a Boston Globe columnist.
Yeah.
She was a big proponent of bringing the Olympics to Boston in 2024.
Oh boy.
Uh, and she basically wrote a column just like relitigating this, saying, "Oh, we would have fixed the MBTA if we had had the
Right.
Olympics here, and we would have had enough housing." And it's like, just, I don't know. It's such a bizarre way of thinking about the world. I mean, first of all, the Olympics is like a parasite. It just like drains communities. But even if it didn't, why do you need like some weird like catalyst, like having a big sporting event to like push people to do the right thing and to build housing and public transportation? It's just such a bizarre way of thinking about the world. Like, why can't people just do what's right? um
Yeah, I mean, and then people complain about having to see houseless people, the unhoused rather, like on the street, like having to see it. And it's just like, yeah, the solution is we provide housing, and actually nobody's housing should be have it shouldn't be the way it is. Like,
Yeah, and I mean
it's a
the
direct
Supreme.
argument for being the exact opposite it is currently. So
We were talking before the show. The Supreme Court just had this ruling that said you can basically like arrest homeless people for like being like camping in public or whatever, even if they have no actual shelter to go to. And then the governor of California just announced that they're basically going to shut down every homeless encampment in the state. And it's magical thinking, basically, that if you just tear down all the tents, all of a sudden the homeless people are going to disappear. They won't be homeless anymore because they're not in a tent. But what happens is they just set up they get another tent and go somewhere else. So they sleep on the street without a tent or whatever. And we've seen this repeated over and over again, like in Boston, like you were mentioning. And Bill Shaner, who I think is another friend of the podcast,
sure is.
has written a lot about this in Worcester, about them shutting down homeless encampments in Worcester. And surprise, surprise, we still have homelessness in Boston and Worcester, and we'll have it in California after they do this, and we're going to have it in Massachusetts regardless of what they do with the shelter system. We need actual housing, permanent housing for people.
And there's other solutions other than just the obvious of house people. There's things we can do to shore up and make sure housing remains stable, like tenants unions. That's something we can do. Office of tenants protections in your local government or the state level government. Rent caps. Like, there's a million things policy wise that have been done in the past that can be done again, like what they did in the 50s in capping house price. Like, I forget. I'm so sorry. Like, I shouldn't even be referencing it, but I do know that they at one point were like, we need to house all these baby boomers. All these people having all these babies, and there was massive tax incentives to get a house. So I don't know. I think there are solutions that can be done, and I'm not an expert on it, but we can always do better. And Maura Healey is a cop, and they can't think of anything other than band-aid fixes because they're a cop. And that's my goolery there. This is why we got to stop promoting cops. And I'm not going to tell people how to vote in the upcoming election. Just vote strategically and in your context, as she would say. Like, my vote doesn't really matter in Massachusetts, so maybe a protest vote, maybe throw a vote Jill Stein's way, show them that a third party is viable. I don't know. There's a million options. Pick what's best for you. But like, I am begging my fellow working class people, please stop promoting prosecutors, please.
Yeah, I mean, when they announced Kamala Harris, it definitely left a bad taste in my mouth. Like, the former prosecutor who's done some pretty shady stuff. And I remember like leftists were all about hating, Kamala
Cops.
as a cop back in, just a few years ago.
A year ago.
And nothing has really fundamentally changed about her. The only thing that's sort of happened is that she's been vice president for 4 years, which is like a do nothing job. So she hasn't really left a record of more horrible stuff that she's done. But I've just seen a lot of people who are just gung ho about her, and I understand that it's like, wow,
our bitching got something, and I think people are in shock a little bit. Like, holy shit.
Just
they
like,
listened.
Wow, the Democrat isn't like a shambling corpse anymore. It's like an actual live human being who can like talk
right
in public. And like, I get that, but I don't know. I was just thinking when this announcement came out from Healy about the shelter system, I was just thinking, like, the comparison of both of them are these former prosecutors who have kind of created this like phony liberal image for themselves, about, oh, I'm a progressive, when they've just had a career full of, being a cop, basically, and you know.
Yeah, no, hey man,
And I can totally see
we know.
Maura Healey, you know, running for national office at some point.
Oh no,
But
my prediction. This is my bold prediction. We got supposedly it's going to be like somebody like Tim Walz, I think, for vice president, something like that. But I predict it's going to be Walz, Healy as AG. I mean, as president and vice president, and then Maura. Wow, my brain. Um, excuse me. It's going to be with Deval Patrick or something, and then in 2032, like it's going to be some combination of those people. Massachusetts governors and Midwest. I just have a strange feeling that's going to be the Democrats' next move after Kamala's 8 years if she wins.
we'll see.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. I mean, Empire is going to keep chugging along, and I mean, I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. It matters a lot. Donald Trump is a fucking menace. Like that man is unhinged. We got to be afraid of that guy. But I think right now, if she wants the vote, Kamala,
How about JD Vance? What are you following him at all?
I've always been his connections to Peter Thiel is all this other stuff,
Yeah.
like the shenanigans that like are coming out or have always kind of like people been kind of been. I'm terminally online, I guess you could call it. So I've like known about JD Vance being a weirdo for a long time, but it's like all of these guys are. I'm like, it's like Matt Gaetz is a weirdo. I'm like, okay, yeah.
But that I find it really interesting that that's kind of becoming the talking point. Is that he's like a weird.
He's the
creep.
lightning rod. I feel like, and it could like work in their favor. Like he's the clown we all look at, and
I don't know. I mean, there's something about everybody just saying you're a weird creep like all the time, constantly. That I feel like a lot of people want to be perceived as normal, and if everybody is saying this guy's like a weird creep, he doesn't want women to vote unless they have kids or like weird stuff like that, like what a fucking weirdo.
Mike Pence was kind of labeled weird too, if I remember correctly. I mean,
he was kind of weird.
I think he's weird, but so I'm not like I'm deathly afraid if that man becomes president, you know, because Trump could definitely die. I mean, look at him; he looks a mess, and he doesn't take good care of himself at all. Like, and that's the other thing. It's like people are bitching about Joe Biden. It's like, guys, I don't know if these Trump acolytes and strategists are talking about like all this is going to fall right in Trump's face if Biden drops out, and then lo and behold, here we are. And it's like, anyway, there's no sense in it's all bad. Like these people are fucking pro murder, so it's like I don't understand like between either party. I feel semi-privileged and blessed to be in, I guess, Massachusetts, but as we just talked about Maura Healey and our justice system, it's just as fucked as elsewhere. It's just like a different brand. But yeah, the Trump, the Kamala stuff. It's like if she could just say we're gonna ceasefire, I guess, like that would probably get her probably secure the vote for her. I doubt she's going to do that though.
I don't know, man.
Do you have a thought, I guess, like between JD Vance and Trump? And I mean, I don't think it's getting weirder. I mean, Trump was weird. I mean, the man before he even got elected was saying he could kill somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. And it's like, that was fucking crazy. So I know I'm not shocked by anything else he said this whole time. And the migrant stuff right off the bat coming down the elevator, that was wild too.
I mean, I don't even want to try to predict what's going to happen. It's, you know, who knows?
I think they did some Democrat fuckery with like manipulating the incumbency into their preferred candidate. You know, I feel like there was an orchestration, like this was a plan.
I just feel like
once they kind of secure the delegates, then I'll drop out. She'll take my money.
The last however many years, the politics of this country have gotten like both weirder and just more like oppressive. And I mean like oppressive in like oppressing your psyche, you know, like it just feels
the doom
like
scroll.
The doom scroll. You just feel like despair all the time. And I try not to despair. because
You got to have joy,
but
man.
you got to have some
gotta-
joy, but at the same time, it's just like, oh man, Jesus.
Yeah, and like already the backfiring with even currently criticizing Kamala's background, where it's like, I as an abolitionist have been consistent on, I know I'm white, I know I grew up middle class, I know that I'm actually relatively comfortable and these policies will not affect me, but before she can earn a vote from me or anybody else, especially somebody that's a prison abolitionist, what do you say to a prison abolitionist? Like, I don't think that that's a ideological line for me. So you're probably not going to get my vote. And I think I'm pretty consistent, but how people are weaponizing her identity is also very, I mean, it's helping out some of the liberals we probably shouldn't be associating with how they weaponize race and how they're deeply racist themselves. And I feel really deeply sorry and scared for all the marginalized groups, because they're the ones who are going to lose. Like, trans people are their existence is being openly debated by Democrats too. Like, when it's okay for them to like transition. It's like, it's not your fucking business. And that's the shit that kind of, I'm just like, both these parties are too far to the right now, and it's genuinely terrifying. So
Yeah.
we got to just build our community, and we got to remember, let's not have like evangelical thoughts about it. Like, there's no rapture, there's no revolution, like a rapture coming. Like, the revolution is here in your mind, in your daily actions, and hopefully it doesn't get, violence is happening currently, so let's hope we can lessen the violence too. And I guess that's how I'll end my thoughts for the weed out today, because the system is very violent and it makes you sad and angry. Like, you telling the story about James Carver, it just makes you want me to punch a hole in the wall. It's like, this is unnecessary. And so many people, this didn't bring the 15 people back either, on top of that. Like, so what's the return on investment here? And I just want to thank you for doing this work, and digging
Thanks.
and participating and bringing it to light to our viewers. Like, the work Andrew has done, I'm just giving the platform here. Like, none of this could be possible without folk like you and Jeff Raymond and people over at the Shoestring, and just journalists, or just people in their community holding community members accountable. And that's important work, and gives me a little faith and a reason to keep going. So appreciate you sharing the story, and please come back on when there's an update for this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, let me just say two things real quick. One, again, it's the mass dump. The mass dump. If you Google it, and if you want to support this work, if you read the stories, it'll explain how you can financially support my work. And the other thing I'll just say, if you're ever in Beverly, Massachusetts, drop by the CVS. It's at the corner of Rantoul and Elliott Street, and that CVS is where the Elliott Chambers used to be. And if you go to the corner, there's a little memorial that has the names of the 15 people who were killed by the fire. So go take a peek at that if you're ever in the area, and just I don't know, take a moment to contemplate. That's where 15 people died from something that might have been preventable, and that, there's a guy in prison for that who maybe had nothing to do with it.
Correct. There's a real lives. This is where true crime, I feel like, desensitized people, and this is like some true crime shit. But so there's real people attached to this. There's real outcomes, and tangible outcomes, and they're not good always. So appreciate you uncovering this, and look forward to having you back on the show. Remember, I'll actually link the mass dump and everything in the show notes. So check your podcast player. Go to www.theweedout.com, or just hit us up on social media. We'd be more than happy to help you out. Look forward to hearing from you again, Andrew, and everybody at home, keep weeding out the bullshit.